What's up guys, and welcome back. Glad to have you. Today I'm working on the third version of the circular saw crosscut jig. Now the main reason I'm doing this is because I got a new saw. So when you get a new saw, you got to make new tools and things and jigs for it. And I do think there's some huge improvement in this jig. For example, you get a deeper cut. You also can use your router on this by just adjusting one of the rails. That's gonna open up a whole world of opportunity. Now, even though version 2 was really nice and I love the way that came out, I actually love this one better because it's a smaller footprint in width wise, and I love that you can just hang it up and store it somewhere. So let's not waste any time. I'm gonna show you how it's made. Now as we get started, you're gonna need a sheet of plywood cut down for the base. You'll also need a 2-inch C-channel, a miter track, and also a hold down clamp and a couple risers. Down in the video description, you can find a set of plans and links to some of the products I used in this video. Now I want to make sure the piece of plywood I'm using is as straight as possible. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw a line across the entire width of it, then double check to make sure that I'm working off of a straight reference. The first line I drew out was not as accurate as I would like it to be, so I went to the opposite end and that was a lot better. I then went on to setting the location for the T-track. Prior to routing the track, I attached a piece of scrap wood to my router guide, and this helped a ton with control of the router. I took off 1/8 inch of a time until I was able to get down to 3/8 of an inch. Now this was about all I needed to do with the base, so at this point I can go ahead and sand it down and get that out of the way. With the base sanded down, I can go ahead and install the T-track. You can use shorter screws, but I only had 3/4 inch screws for this application, and I ended up cutting off the tips so that they didn't exit out the back. To create the saw track, I'm going to rip down a 2-inch C-channel. Now I wouldn't get too concerned, this doesn't have to be a straight rip down the middle. The goal is to separate it, giving you 2 tracks that the saw can ride on. Now this is some really hard metal to cut through, but the reciprocating saw and the Diablo blade I'm using just slice right through this. I'll link the tools and stuff I'm using down in the video description. Now after ripping the metal down, the edge may be a bit sharp, so you want to take a file and or also a sander to just smooth that out a bit. Rather than sitting on top, I'm going to recess the tracks down inside of the risers. And I want to make sure that these are parallel to each other and everything lines up, so I'm going to do all the work at the same time. After cutting the outside line by hand, I then took a router and routed out the section. My intention was to route out a section and also leave some areas untouched so that I can use that to support the router base. Unfortunately, I made some of the routed areas too wide and it couldn't support the router, so I had to then switch over to the chisel to finish this job. The piece of plywood on the back was to prevent the router from creating blowouts, but since I went away from that, I ended up removing that so I can have clearance to cut out this section. This T-track screw will remain in the track on the jig and I won't be able to remove it. I could make an opening wide enough so that the screw can slide off, but I just don't want to weaken the support on the risers. My solution to this is to channel out an area where the screw can sit. Now this part is pretty important, especially if you want to take full advantage of the cut capacity within the opening. And with this method, it allows you to slide the screw out of the way. Before permanently attaching the risers, make sure that you put the screw on the T-track before moving on. To secure the risers to the base, you want to make sure you check for squaring, add wood glue, and also drill in a few screws. I'll repeat the same process on the opposite end while making sure it's squared. After the glue has set up, I'm going to place the tracks in the opening. Then I'm going to sit the saw on top of the track and make sure I get the proper spacing. After drilling a hole in each track, I then install some wood screws to hold that end down while I move on to the next. I'm going to countersink the screw holes so that the saw doesn't interfere with the head of the screw. Each screw will be installed in a threaded insert. And since this is a multi-purpose jig, we're going to then line up the new area for the router base. And once these areas are drilled out, I can then install a couple more threaded insert. I salvaged these inserts from some old furniture, so I wasn't quite sure how big of an hole I should drill. I ended up breaking a couple of them, so if they're too hard to go in, just back them out, drill a slightly bigger hole, and try it again. I'm going to use black paint to finish off the metal track and also the risers. This should give it a finished look. I only put on one thin layer of spray paint and make sure you don't get any paint inside the tracks. With the tracks installed, I'm going to now drill out a hanging hole. I don't know why, but I was a bit nervous to make the first cut, but it was a success. I did run into a slight problem though, is when you need to pull back, I have to hold on to the blade guard because it kept getting in the way. As a quick fix, I took a bracket and formed it to act as a stop. I didn't want to drill a new hole, so I'm going to utilize the existing one there, so I'll be using a wrench to install this bolt from now on. Now if my tracks were wider at the bottom, I wouldn't need it because the track would catch that. So the next thing I need to do is create some attachments so I can make miter cuts. For this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to make two different angles. One is cut to 22.5 and the other one is cut to 45. Keep in mind you can make as many as you like, but I'm going to show you the process. The smaller pieces will be attached to the longer piece you see here, which will reference off the straight edge, setting the piece of wood to an angle, so when it's saw cut, it's automatically going to cut at an angle. I'm going to utilize the bolt that's used for the hold down clamp as a pivot point. I clamped the two long lumber and drilled the holes in the same section. These boards can be any length, it just needs to extend past the cut area of the saw blade. Now to make this as accurate as possible, I'm going to reference off my speed square. Assuming that this miter piece is very accurate, it's going to force this board to sit at a 45-degree angle. To glue this and finalize it, I'm going to use the speed square to help reference off of that and check as many things I can. I'm going to also take the knob and hold this down so that it doesn't budge. Then I can take a clamp and lock this into place. Notice how there's no gap in between the speed square and also the piece of lumber, and this is consistent the whole distance. After wrapping up the first miter attachment, I then took on the second miter attachment and wrapped that up. As the ends are uneven and they're not lined up, I'm going to cut off the excess and make sure that it's all the same. To install these, you're going to line them up on the screw and swing it onto the track, then tighten it down. I would recommend you double check this with a speed square every time you set up one of these attachments. With this design, you can set the miter attachment just about anywhere. Now you can go ahead and cut down the miter attachment, and I did this for both. Now to hold your subject down, you can use a clamp or you can use a hold down clamp, as I'm doing here if you have enough room. Now I was expecting this to be accurate because of all the pre-setup, but I was really surprised on how accurate this was. So let's look at a few of the possibilities that you can get from this jig. Well, we now know that you can get 45-degree cuts, not only from 45 degrees, but 22.5 and just about any angles you want to create. So one of the bigger improvement I've made versus the older jigs that was created was the cut capacity. As you can see, both measuring system, this should give you an idea on how much you can cut. Now, although this circular saw is a battery powered one, it is a beast. It has sliced through every material I've put in front of it. Another cool feature of the exercise is to safely make dados and half lap joints. There's a lot of cool features to this jig. Although it doesn't replace a table saw or a miter saw, you can accomplish some of the same tasks. Now, routers tend to scare a lot of people, so here's a really cool way to use your router and use it safely. Make the necessary adjustment to your rails based on what was done previously, clamp your piece down, and then you can simply make a dado cut. Maybe you need to flatten the board. You just put your board under here and then you just run your router back and forth. So let's say you have a 3/4 inch piece of plywood or something thinner. What you could do is you could put another piece of material under it to bring that up closer to the router bit, and this way you can work safely. Alright guys, so that is it for this one. I am Glenn, and thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. I'd love to have you. If you're planning to build this jig, I'd love to hear what you'll be doing with this one. If you need additional directions, then I have a set of plans, which is a great way to support what I do. If you want to see what I'm working on next, best way to do so, join me on Instagram at More DIY Creators. And that's it for this one. Catch you on the next one.